Goofy Historians is the funnest place to learn about history. Or is it the funniest? Can I interview you? Or you? Or you? Or you? Or maybe you guys? How about you?
Welcome, everybody. This is a humorous history podcast, and we are the Goofy Historians. Today we have a great show. I'm excited to talk about the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. This is going to be fun because it's not only a departure from our usual dark topics of wars and generals and kings and sultans, but we also have David Pike returning to help us out and maybe speak in some Old English. So with my brother Joseph and David Pike, we have two folks who's actually read this. In fact, probably you can say studied it in school. As opposed to me, who like a caveman only recently discovered the tales after learning the lyrics of a song by Procol Harum called Whiter Shade of Pale, but we'll talk more on that later. So I'm briefly going to talk about two of my favorite tales, the Miller's Tale and the Monk's Tale. And Joseph and David Pike will pick different tales, hopefully, to discuss. So, the Goofy Historians presents the Canterbury Tales. We were thinking about calling this Medieval Spring Break or Road Trip to Canterbury. The whole thing was just rowdy, profane, and blasphemous. And don't forget saucy. It was very saucy. The more one reads the tales, the more questions bubble to the surface. There are stories within stories. The way that the travelers addressed each other was strange. It was like they were using these fighting words while still being polite. And I'm wondering if that was just a characteristic of the upper class at that time, which for the most part they were a part of. So it's strange. I don't want to be pedantic in terms of realism here, but there was 30 of them and they were all on horses. So I'm not exactly sure how audibly they can hear each other's stories. It would have probably been helpful if they were all like in a bus. I think there's a rap song about them in a bus. But anyway, but just some caution here. 200 years after this was written, in the year 1635, a gentleman by the name of Brian Walker of County Durham was found guilty of numerous instances of blasphemy. Witnesses reported that on multiple occasions, Mr. Walker made his comparison from a book called Chaucer to the Bible, stating that they were both commendable words or similar. That sounds like hearsay. Objection! Hearsay. Anyway, he probably needed a better attorney. So, Geoffrey Chaucer, I'm just going to call him Jeff. He was born in 1340 and died in 1400. During those years, the Black Death, or what we know was now is the bubonic plague, killed half of Europe. What? Half? Yeah. So think about that for a second. When I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, until today, the population has doubled, the population of the planet. So just imagine that in reverse. So these guys were the survivors of the Black Death, and there was the 100 Years' War, and anyway. So, but they never talk about any tragedies, and that they don't even talk about their own recent, histories of the hell that they had went through, because this was just, a few decades after the Black Death killed half of everybody. It's crazy. But they were in good humor. So Jeff Reed Chaucer. Jeff was a military guy. He was captured by the French in the 100-Year War, which would have been interesting because it was the age of chivalry and you just got ransomed. I think they had to pay like 20 pounds for him or something. He was a government bureaucrat, and he clearly worked for the king's court, the court of Edward III. Several times he got robbed, and he got robbed. They stole the king's money, which is crazy. So it all begins in April. That's why we were going to call it medieval spring break. April is a time for pilgrimage, and what better destination for a pilgrimage than Canterbury to seek out a blessing from St. Thomas. Now, we did a video on this a while back, and Henry II was the king. This was a few hundred years before, and he accidentally had Thomas Becket killed. Thomas Becket and Henry II grew up together. They were best friends. He made when Henry became king, he made Thomas Becket the Archbishop of Canterbury, which still exists today, and which this story is about. They're going to. But anyway, it was a big mistake. He didn't really mean to have him killed, and he had to pay for a crusade. But anyway, that's where they're off to. And St. Thomas, there's a couple St. Thomases, but probably not the first one, like from the Bible. St. Thomas is Thomas Becket. And he was a saint to help you when you're sick, which I guess makes sense if you just survived the Black Plague. Okay, so Jeff and just a few of his traveling companions. There was the knight, and he had traveled everywhere. And his story is first, and it's the longest, most boring story. And nobody was buying his mercenary BS. Another guy was the squire, which was the knight's son, and he was like all strong and romantic and that kind of thing. There was a yeoman, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, a yeoman, Y-E-O-M-A-N. That guy was the knight's servant, and he's basically looked like an elf. But I guess it wasn't really an elf. There was the prioress nun, who's this sophisticated lady, had great manners, and she had her own entourage, 2 priests, a chaplain, and another nun. There was a monk who I'm going to talk about. He was like really handsome and liked to hunt. There was a friar who appeared to be poor and righteous, but I'm not so sure about the righteous part. There was a merchant who was fancy. There was a scholar who was from Oxford. There was a sergeant at law and his buddy, the Franklin. And I guess that means that he was like a sort of, a lawyer or something. And a Franklin is like somebody, just a landowner, turns out, I think. There was a miller, who I'm going to talk about a little bit. And he was just a drunk, rowdy, crazy guy. I'm not even sure how many stories there were in total. Some of them are left unfinished. But there was 30 travelers, including Jeff. And to pass the time, they all tell a story, and whoever tells the best story gets a free dinner. They all buy that person dinner. I think that was the contest. But since Chaucer never finished it, we don't know who won. So we're going to have theories of who won. I'll tell you right now, I think it was the miller. But that's not my only theory. We'll talk about later. Okay, so anyway, so we get to figure out about who these characters were and what their stories are. And I'm not sure why Chaucer didn't finish it, but I think it was actually published unfinished. So, just a quick story real quick is that the inspiration for the lyrics of that song that I talked about, Procol Harum, was Chaucer's The Miller's Tale, and also Bach for the music part. The line goes, and it was that later, as the miller told his tale, that her face at first just ghostly turned a whiter shade of pale. And then when I heard that in the miller's tale, and it led me to Chaucer, and we're still not sure exactly what that line means, but my interpretation is it has to be about the nun prioress being embarrassed by the miller's tale. Because after I talk about it, you'll be embarrassed too. Anyway, the Canterbury Tales is a huge work of literature, and we're not even going to attempt to cover it all. But let's see here. So the miller's tale and the monk's tale. I'll tell the monk's tale first because I like it. So the monk was this handsome guy, but he was a monk, so he was chaste, so he didn't get to be with any ladies and that kind of thing. And they were giving him a hard time about that, which is crazy. That they were like, "Oh, wow, if you weren't a monk, you'd be like getting laid all the time." And I'm like, "What? They really said that?" Anyway, so the monk tells this tale, and he's a good monk, so he just tells a not bawdy or saucy tale like some of the other folks. But anyway, his tales, it's like stories inside stories, and he tells a bunch of stories from history, which is cool because if you think about it, this is the 13th century, and people are telling stories about history. It's like this common knowledge that we all share. Anyway, all of his stories deal with the tragic mode. That's where folks, throughout history who had high station and then fell to the depths of tragedy. So the monk tells a bunch of stories with that theme. Some of the characters that he talks about are Lucifer, Adam from Adam and Eve, Samson from Samson and Delilah, I guess, Hercules, Nebuchadnezzar, and my favorite, Beelzebub. Now, Beelzebub was a real king. He was a king in Babylon. This is Bronze Age history. So this story is the story of where the king of Babylon meets Daniel from the Bible. Daniel from the lion's den. Anyway, yeah, same Daniel. So anyway, Daniel's in Babylon now, and and Beelzebub knows Daniel apparently. But anyway, so the king is having this big party, and he's just living it up like he always does. And he brings out these glasses, these chalices that he stole from Jerusalem, and they're partying down. And then, scariest part of the Bible ever, a hand comes up and it writes on the wall. It saw Mene, Tikal, Paris, and nothing more. And everybody's freaking out. They're like, whoa, what just happened? So Beelzebub gets all the wizards and smart people in his realm together, and they can't figure it out. And finally they're like, oh, go get Daniel. Maybe he can tell you. So Daniel comes in, and right away he knows, and he's like, oh, hey, man, I got, some bad news for you. Translated means that you're going to have a great suffering, and long story short, your reign is over. And according to the Bible, like that night or the next day, Babylon was conquered by Darius, the Persian. So anyway, what is the lesson there aside from the the tragedy tale, the tragic mode theme? The lesson there is the Bible just got it completely wrong, because the Persians did conquer Babylon, but not in Beelzebub's time. Anyway, Bibles, you can't go for the Bible for history. Okay, so the other tale, and then I'm done, is the miller's tale. So the miller's this drunk redneck, and he just can't stop being profane, and he's just Sounds like a fun guy to be around, actually. So he tells a story of a carpenter, his 18-year-old wife, Ellison, this guy named Fly Nicholas, and another guy named Absalom. So the carpenter's an older guy. He's got a lot of money. In his house, he has a renter named Fly Nicholas. And Nicholas is a scholar, and he's real smart. And he's an expert in astrology. He's an astrological genius. And that Absalom guy, I don't know what he is. He's kind of like a bard. He sings songs. He's real sensitive. Anyway, so Allison is a real, she's a hottie, if you will. So she's like all, I don't even know how to say this, but Fly Nicholas and Allison are, they can't stay away from each other. Fly Nicholas is flirting with her like crazy, and she reciprocates, but she's like, we got to be careful or my husband, the carpenter, will, chop us up or something. And the other guy, Absalom, he was like always singing. He was in love with Ellison too, but more in like an innocent way. He was like singing her love songs and stuff. So anyway, long story short, Ellison and Nicholas Nicholas devises the plan, that he can tell the carpenter that because of his astrological genius, he knows that Noah's flood is coming back again. It's going to rain, and everybody's going to be flooded, and the carpenter and his beautiful wife, Allison, are going to drown. And anyway, through this crazy thing, he gets the carpenter to believe this crazy story. And they're all up. He has them put like these tubs, little boats up on the roof, so when it rains, they'll be safe. Anyway, it was all just a ruse to get Allison. And then Allison and Nicholas spend the night together. And then Absalom is like playing or singing outside the window, and she sticks her butt out, and he thought that he kissed her. Anyway, so the whole town found out about it, and they all laughed at the carpenter. So the Miller's Tale is just basically making fun of the carpenter. And it turns out that one of the other tales is the carpenter takes revenge on the miller. So anyway, that's kind of my take on the Canterbury Tales. And looking forward to what the other folks have to say, and then we'll talk with you real soon. Okay, bye for now.
Goofy Historians is the funnest place to learn about history. Or is it the funniest? Does history repeat itself? Not really. But sometimes it kind of rhymes.